Russia is so desperate that it's trading away territory just to stay afloat. While the world watches Moscow bleed in Ukraine, something far more permanent is unfolding in the east, as China and North Korea are quietly taking over Russia's Far East. This isn't just some random event. With Kyiv and NATO turning up the pressure, Putin has turned this vast frontier into a bargaining chip. What was once a symbol of imperial strength is now a playground for foreign influence, where Chinese investors and North Korean labor are reshaping the region in exchange for assistance. In this video, we'll break down the deals, the consequences, and we'll see just why Russia will never get this land back. Let's start by going to the root cause of Russia's desperation: its war in Ukraine. This invasion, which is now in its fourth year, has drained the country on every front. Military, economic, demographics. Right now, sources say that over 1 million Russians have been killed or wounded, drastically reducing Russia's pool of young, able-bodied men. When it comes to equipment, the story's just the same. Russia's military is struggling on its last legs. It has been reduced to running on outdated Soviet machinery and low-quality parts. The once proud military machine now almost entirely depends on imports of basic electronics and drones from China, Iran, and even North Korea. It's a far cry from the superpower image Moscow once projected. Sanctions have only made things worse. Russia's access to Western finance and technology has been cut off, and what remains of its export income is tied almost entirely to China and a few friendly countries. The ruble has been through freefall after freefall, inflation has eaten away its savings, and the government's budget depends heavily on war spending. Russia still has nukes and oil, but its ability to act like a global power has shrunk dramatically. Basically, Russia is on its knees, and nowhere is that decline more visible than in the Far East. Russia's Far East is a vast, resource-rich expanse that stretches from eastern Siberia to the Pacific Ocean, covering nearly 40% of Russia's total territory, but only home to about 5% of its population. It borders China, North Korea, and the Sea of Japan, and includes key regions like Primorske Krai, Sakhalin, and Kamchatka. Despite its sparse population, the area holds immense strategic value with abundant natural resources, vital Pacific ports, and growing influence from neighboring powers through trade, infrastructure, and long-term land deals. However, as rich and strategic as it might be, it is remote and expensive to maintain. That's why, for decades, Moscow treated it like a distant outpost, more useful as a symbol of empire than as a functioning economy. So now, with the Far East sitting idle and Moscow running out of options, Russia has begun offering up land and access in exchange for help. It's not calling it that, of course. Officially, it's about development, investment, and regional growth. But behind the press releases and the ribbon cuttings, the deals are clear. China gets long-term leases, control over infrastructure, and first pick of natural resources. North Korea gets timber contracts, transit routes, and quiet arms shipments. Russia, in return, gets access to resources it can't produce or get on its own. This isn't some grand partnership, it's survival, a last-ditch effort by Putin's regime to keep its available partners happy and pouring in money and resources. China and North Korea are essentially moving in and calling it home. Russian officials talk about revitalizing the region, but the reality is that foreign companies are managing key facilities, and local economies now almost entirely depend on outside money to function. Russia calls it a win-win partnership, but it's the kind of win where one side gets a trophy and the other gets a participation ribbon. In some areas, China's firms oversee operations while Russian staff handles the paperwork. It's not a handover, but it's about as close as it gets. Russia has been reduced to background figures in their own land. This is pretty shocking, because the Far East used to be a symbol of Russian pride. Now it's nothing more than a patchwork of foreign-run projects held together by desperation. Moscow still owns the land, but it's no longer calling the shots. What started as a way to keep the region alive has turned into a quiet shift in control. The deeper those deals go, the harder they'll be to undo. Every deal that the Kremlin signs with these two nations seems to just come with strings that tie tighter over time. And those strings are now wrapped around Russia's energy sector. By last year, trade between Russia and China had shot up to around $245 billion, a sharp rise from $190 billion just 3 years earlier. On the surface, it looks like progress, but most of that trade is tilted in China's favor. Russian oil and gas are sold at steep discounts, often 30 or 40% below global benchmarks, while Chinese goods flood Russian markets. The imbalance isn't just economic, it is strategic. For every pipeline, factory, or power station that China builds in the Far East, it gains control through long leases, ownership stakes, or debt deals that Moscow cannot afford to break. And this shift is reshaping more than just local economies. With projects like the Power of Siberia 2 in the works, Russia's Far East is becoming the main route for gas exports to Asia. Even by 2024, over 60% of Russian energy exports were already heading east. That gives China more control over pricing and supply, while Europe is left scrambling for alternatives. Even North Korea benefits, securing fuel and infrastructure perks that ease its shortages. What started as a way to keep the region running has turned into a power play. Russia trades cheap energy for survival, but in doing so, it hands Beijing the keys to a region that now matters more than ever. The eastern frontier is no longer just a bargaining chip. It is the pivot point, where global influence is quietly shifting. Beijing isn't just investing in Russia's Far East, it's embedding itself. Chinese companies are upgrading ports, expanding railways, and building logistics hubs that serve both trade and long-term strategy. North Korea is also taking advantage, sending labor and technical teams to support construction and timber operations. For Russia, these deals are driven by desperation. For its neighbors, they're a rare chance to gain ground without resistance, though they would certainly never openly admit to that. The Tumen River region captures this story perfectly. It's a small but strategically vital strip of land where Russia, China, and North Korea meet, a spot that has long attracted the attention of empire builders. Historically, it's been a flashpoint of territorial disputes. That's part of the history that explains why this land matters so much to China. The Far East was once Chinese territory, until it was taken by the Russian Empire in the 1800s through a series of what China calls the unequal treaties. The 1858 Treaty of Aigun and the 1860 Treaty of Peking forced Beijing to surrender more than 600,000 square kilometers of land north of the Amun River and east of the Pacific coast. That loss cut China off from the Sea of Japan and still lingers in its national memory. For generations, Chinese maps marked these regions with faint dashed lines, labeling them as lost lands. In schools and political speeches, the story of the Far East was used to remind citizens of humiliation under foreign powers. Now many in Beijing see history coming full circle. They don't need to invade this land. They can simply buy it, lease it, and populate it. Instead of soldiers, it's sending engineers, investors, and long-term contracts. Roads, ports, and railways are going up, and with each project, Beijing regains influence, quietly, steadily, and without firing a shot. North Korea's goals are simpler, but just as calculated. It sees Russia's weakness as a way to secure resources and safe zones for its workforce. China brings capital, North Korea brings manpower, and Russia, cornered by war and sanctions, takes whatever help it can get. New bridges and roads are being built across the Tumen. The old railway link from 1959 is being supplemented by a brand new road bridge that connects the three countries directly. In theory, it's about trade and development. In reality, it's about access to the Pacific, something China has always wanted from its northeastern border. For North Korea, the project brings modern infrastructure and a chance to anchor itself into a regional network. For Russia, it's quiet concession, a way to secure investment without publicly admitting weakness. And those deals are piling up. In the Russia Far East, there are now hundreds of long-term land leases signed with Chinese companies. Some of these extended several decades. The land is still Russian in name, but everything that happens on it is controlled by Beijing's investors and managers. That's how you lose territory in the modern era, not through invasion, but through contracts written in small print. To grasp the full scale of what Moscow is giving away, we need to look at how these deals actually transfer control of land to Beijing. Russia's dependence on China isn't just about trade or energy, it's about territory. In quiet ways, Russia is paying for China's help with pieces of its own land. On paper, these deals are called leases or development partnerships. In practice, they give Beijing control over vast areas of Russia's Far East, sometimes for nearly a century. Since 2022, Chinese companies have gained rights to huge tracts of farmland and forest in regions like Amur and Zabakalsky. Many of these contracts, like we've just discussed, last 49 to 99 years. This is long enough for whole generations to grow up under Chinese management. What that means is that entire Russian generations will grow up knowing nothing outside of the fact that the Chinese run things in their own homeland. Already, local reports estimate that Chinese firms now run more than 1.5 million hectares, or almost 4 million acres of farmland in Russia's east. That's nearly 5 times what they held before the war in Ukraine. The deals are often signed at rock-bottom prices or exchanged for supplies Moscow desperately needs: engines, chips, chemicals, and spare parts for its weapons. Even resource zones are changing hands. Chinese miners are extracting gold and rare metals under joint ventures, where Moscow technically keeps ownership, but all the profits and operations are controlled from across the border. Some Russian officials quietly call this land for survival, because the Kremlin can no longer afford to say no. Moscow's so busy fighting in Ukraine, it hasn't fully noticed that its Far East is getting a Chinese makeover, complete with new signs and a different vibe. Refusing Beijing would mean cutting off the flow of fuel additives, military electronics, and factory equipment that keeps Russia's war and economy running. That's definitely a non-starter. But these deals aren't temporary patches either. They're shaping a new reality on the ground, where Russian sovereignty is increasingly symbolic. Demographics reinforce the same story too. Right now, there are roughly 2 million Chinese nationals living and working between Vladivostok and the Urals. In several cities, they make up the majority of the local population. Chinese businesses dominate retail, agriculture, and construction. North Korean laborers, meanwhile, fill the gaps in mining, logging, and farming. There are 15,000 of them already in Russia, and plans for up to 50,000 more in war zones like occupied Ukraine, earning Pyongyang up to $1.3 billion a year. The few Russian workers who remain depend on this influx for their livelihoods. Many small towns now run entirely on Chinese capital and North Korean labor. Culturally and economically, the region is shifting. And it's not just about economics. Every port, bridge, and pipeline China builds in Russia's eastern frontier serves a second purpose. These aren't just trade routes, they're strategic tools. Roads that carry freight can just as easily move around armored vehicles. Power stations lighting up border towns can support radar communications. Cargo ports can double as naval docks. Each project is dual use, and Beijing is fully aware of it. In fact, because of this, there have been no shortage of theories, with some holding more weight than others. Russia's military planners are aware as well. They see what's happening, but with so many resources tied up in Ukraine, they're really in no position to push back. The Kremlin can't afford to challenge China, and it certainly can't afford to lose its support. So it wraps the deals in friendly language, calling them win-win partnerships. But anyone paying attention knows who's really winning. It's like mistakenly letting a snake into the henhouse and now having to pretend it's a guest. At this point, it's not a secret that Russia's grip on the Far East is slipping. By handing over control of key infrastructure, Moscow is outsourcing its sovereignty. Military analysts in Japan, South Korea, and the United States are watching closely. Every new pipeline, bridge, or logistics hub is another sign that the balance of power is shifting. The region may still fly the Russian flag, but the decisions shaping it are being made elsewhere. That doesn't help that under Xi Jinping, China's ambitions are big, and the Far East fits neatly into a larger vision. For Beijing, this isn't about trade. It's about geography and power. Access to the Sea of Japan gives China a northern maritime route that bypasses the choke points it worries about in the south, like the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. That's huge for both strategy and trade. It means Chinese ships can reach the Pacific without relying on routes that the US Navy can block during a crisis. For military planners in Beijing, that's priceless. This new corridor also links up perfectly with China's Belt and Road strategy. The Belt and Road isn't just about building railways and ports, it's about creating a network of dependency that ties countries to China through infrastructure. Every bridge and rail line that Beijing builds in another country becomes a lever of influence. Once a region depends on Chinese logistics, it can't easily break free. The Russian eastern frontier is quietly becoming one of those levers. But China's interest in Russia's Far East isn't just about land or resources. It's also about the sea. The region gives China a direct link to the Arctic and the Northern Sea Route, a shortcut between Asia and Europe that's becoming more accessible as the ice melts. Beijing has quietly invested in Russian Arctic ports and LNG projects under what it calls the Polar Silk Road. At face value, it looks like a trade partnership. In practice, it lets China shape how northern shipping lanes are managed, and it gives Chinese ships potential year-round access to routes that bypass Western-controlled choke points like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Malacca. Control of the Far East is therefore a step towards controlling the flow of global trade itself. For North Korea, the goals are different but still strategic. Pyongyang gains access to better infrastructure, a steady stream of resources, and valuable hard currency. It also builds leverage over Russia, which now needs North Korean labor and logistics more than ever. In exchange for its cooperation, Pyongyang gets what it really wants: fuel, weapons, and a louder voice in regional politics. It's a win that costs them little but pays off long-term. All this is pointing to a pattern that we are already seeing get solidified. China and North Korea aren't just seizing an opportunity, they're milking Russia's weakness for every last drop of advantage. And these changes aren't short-term. China and North Korea are planning decades ahead. They have seen a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a heist the likes the world has never seen. These two are not just reacting to Russia's weakness. They're reshaping the map to fit their long-term ambitions. The new road bridge over the Tumen River is only one part of a much larger strategy. Every new project, whether a power line, an industrial park, or a housing zone, adds another thread to the web they're spinning across the region. On their watch, ports are expanding, railways are being modernized, and special economic zones are popping up across the Tumen and the Rasan area of North Korea, designed to integrate with Chinese supply chains. But beneath the scaffolding, something darker is unfolding. These builds come with a hidden cost to the land itself. Across the Tumen River, dredging and roadwork are disrupting a fragile delta shared by 3 nations. It is a zone rich in biodiversity and already under pressure. Forests are being stripped at accelerating rates to make way for timber mills and industrial parks. This is encroaching on habitats like those of the endangered Amur tiger, whose range stretches deep into Siberia. Recent studies show a widening gap between development and environmental safeguards, with 5.59 million hectares lost in recent years, and annual boreal rates hitting 20,000 square kilometers, driven by logging crews. That's an insane amount of land to be talking about. Water quality is also falling due to runoff from construction sites, and the air is thickening with emissions from new factories. Conservation groups are sounding the alarm, calling for transparent impact assessments before irreversible damage sets in. But those calls are largely ignored. It's a bitter irony. Russia once held its wilderness as a badge of national pride, vast, untouched, and fiercely protected. Now, in the rush to secure foreign investment, that legacy is being sacrificed. North Korean logging crews, often operating with minimal oversight, are accelerating deforestation and turning once verdant zones into skeletal landscapes. And still, despite all of this, the project continues. The deals demand progress, and nature is the collateral. Money really does run the world, doesn't it? Take a close look at Russia's eastern frontier, and you'll notice something hard to ignore. The biggest projects like dredging, energy grids, warehouses, and farming are being run by Chinese state-backed companies. That's not just trade, it's control. On top of that, private investors from China are setting up logistics hubs and retail centers that feel more like Manchuria than Russia. In some towns, the signs are in both languages. Chinese businesses grab the best locations while Russian shops steadily disappear. It's not loud or dramatic, it's slow, steady, and deliberate. In some places, the shift feels almost complete. Towns that once relied on Moscow's subsidies now depend entirely on Chinese trade. Local schools are teaching Mandarin alongside Russian. Markets are filled with Chinese goods. Even local governance is influenced by foreign investors, who quietly dictate where roads and factories are built. The eastern frontier isn't just a border region anymore, it's becoming an extension of the Chinese economic system. It's so bad that now, certain Russian officials are starting to speak up. They've watched this shift unfold for years, but the tone is changing. The governor of Primorye, for example, hasn't held back. He's accused China of trying to reshape the story, challenge how history is remembered and who gets to write it.
In general, it's complicated if we don't pay attention to the fact that our region has never historically belonged to China.
That's not just about textbooks, it's about identity. When foreign companies start to shape the land, the economy, and even the language, people start asking who's really in charge. Despite the governor's efforts to shield Primorsky Krai, China and North Korea aren't slowing down. They've already secured the basics like roads, ports, and supply routes, and now they're moving into new territory. China is rolling out its high-tech agenda, wiring Vladivostok with smart logistics hubs and automated factories. These aren't just upgrades, they're footholds. Systems built to serve Chinese supply chains are now shaping how the region moves goods, tracks inventory, and runs production. Tourism is getting pulled into the mix too. China is setting up cross-border travel routes and turning old sites into polished destinations. North Korea, not wanting to be left behind, is testing small tourism projects along its own border. After the floods this year, reconstruction opened up new space for trade and jobs, and Pyongyang is using that momentum to expand its reach. It's not flashy, but it's steady. Even with a dip in exports to North Korea in August, the overall flow of cooperation is growing. Trade is no longer just about raw materials. It's now tied to tech, services, and influence. While Russia scrambles to stay afloat, its neighbors are turning the Far East into a launch pad. They're not just reacting to Moscow's weakness. They're building something that connects to South Korea's recovery, North Korea's labor push, and China's long-term strategy. And they're doing it subtly, through deals that look harmless in theory but shift control over time. That's what makes it hard to spot. The change isn't loud. It's layered through factories, tourism, and logistics. All of it stitched together in a way that feels normal until you realize who's really running the show. The eastern frontier isn't just a resource zone anymore. It's becoming a proving ground, shaped by outsiders while Russia watches from the sidelines. Migration plays a huge role in this transformation. It's not random. It's organized. First comes the engineers and the technicians, then the entrepreneurs and the service workers. Finally, their families follow. By the time Russian authorities realize how deep the change runs, the demographic shift is already permanent. Visa rules have been relaxed, and local officials, desperate to attract any kind of investment, welcome the newcomers with open arms. As if to echo these fears, it's not all smooth sailing on the ground. In cities like Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, people have mixed feelings about the growing Chinese presence. Some say the new jobs and steady cash flow are better than watching their towns shrink while Moscow looks the other way. They see the investment as a lifeline, something to keep the lights on. But others, they're not convinced. They point to the Chinese takeover as a slow shift in the look and feel of their neighborhoods. For them, it's starting to feel less like Russia and more like something else entirely. That unease isn't just quiet grumbling. Nationalist groups and online forums are picking up steam, warning of a slow takeover. Some even dig up old fears from the 1990s, when books and articles claimed Chinese migration was just the first step towards something bigger. Those stories may have faded, but the suspicion hasn't. And while national surveys still show strong support for Russia-China ties, the mood in the Far East tells a different story. Workers who have been pushed out of major projects are growing bitter. They see foreign crews getting the contracts, while locals are left on the sidelines. They warn that Chinese companies aren't building these projects for Russia's benefit, but for their own long-term expansion. They say that Moscow is giving away its strategic backyard, piece by piece. Now and then, that frustration spills out. In places like Primorski Krai, small protests call for tighter rules on land deals and foreign leases. They don't make headlines, but they're happening. It's not a wave of resistance, more like a slow current. Still, it's enough to show that not everyone is on board with the way things are changing. But those warnings tend to fall on deaf ears. The war has no room left for pride. When the budget is stretched, soldiers are dying, and Western trade is gone, practicality always wins out over patriotism. The Kremlin doesn't like the situation. It needs the money and the manpower. It's caught in a cycle that it can't break. The more support it receives, the more the war escalates. The more it escalates, the more support it needs. This cycle locks Russia into deeper dependence, with Beijing and Pyongyang reaping steady gains. Still, Moscow isn't just watching from the sidelines as 40% of its country gets taken. To counter China's growing grip on the eastern frontier, the Kremlin is quietly reaching out to other players. India is first in line. This year, the two countries ramped up energy deals and joint ventures. They even have plans to pour billions into gas fields and tech zones that don't run through Beijing's pipelines. Russia is inviting India and Vietnam into the party, hoping they'll bring enough snacks to balance out China's buffet takeover. Vietnam has also joined the mix, opening talks on fisheries and logistics to help Russia diversify its trade routes and reduce reliance on Chinese infrastructure. The outrage doesn't stop there. Russian officials, including Sergei Shoigu, frequently make rounds in Indonesia and Malaysia, pushing for deeper cooperation despite the weight of sanctions. It's a calculated move. Moscow knows leaning too heavily on one or two neighbors is risky, so it's trying to stitch together a broader Asian network, one that gives it options and a bit of breathing room. Despite all these efforts, the challenges haven't gone away. Russia's shrinking population and sluggish returns still drag down progress. But these moves show a government trying to claw back some control in a region where it has been steadily losing ground. It's a game of catch-up, and China still holds most of the cards. Compared to Beijing's flood of investment, Russia's gestures are small. Still, they're not nothing. They are signals that Moscow hasn't given up on shaping its own backyard. But even as the Kremlin tries to widen its circle, the logic behind its decisions remains brutally simple. The eastern frontier doesn't deliver quick wins. It is a vast, frozen stretch with fewer than 7 million people scattered across an area larger than Europe. Keeping it alive costs billions every year, and in wartime, that is money Moscow doesn't have. So, the government frames concessions as practical development deals. Let China build a port and the region gets jobs. Let North Korea send workers and construction moves faster. In print, the territory stays Russian. On the ground, control is shared and increasingly uneven. Each quiet concession adds up. One bridge here, one port lease there, a few thousand work permits approved without oversight. Slowly, the map begins to shift. What used to be a clear national border is turning into a patchwork of economic zones and trade corridors run by foreign firms. It is soft power, but the consequences are hard, and the neighbors are watching. Japan and South Korea see the shift and don't like what it means. For Tokyo, the Far East transformation threatens its northern flank. Chinese access to the Sea of Japan opens new routes for trade, yes, but also for military operations. A Chinese-controlled port means more patrols, more shipping under Beijing's watch, and possibly new naval resupply points within reach of Japanese waters. South Korea sees a different kind of risk. Pyongyang's growing role as a broker between Moscow and Beijing gives North Korea leverage that it hasn't had in years. It is no longer dependent on China alone. It can now play both sides, extract concessions, and strengthen its position. That could mean more funding for weapons, more confidence in negotiations, and more trouble for Seoul. And then there's the United States. Washington is distracted, juggling crises in Europe and the Middle East. But analysts are paying attention. They see the same pattern. China building a quiet logistics network that stretches across Eurasia and deep into what used to be solidly Russian ground. The eastern frontier may look remote, but it is plugged into everything that matters in the Indo-Pacific. It's changing how the United States thinks about supply routes, naval access, and containment, and it's happening fast. In think tanks and Pentagon briefings, the conversation has already shifted. The question isn't whether China will expand influence, it's how far it's willing to go before someone pushes back. Every new road and port in the Russian Far East makes it harder for Washington to contain Beijing's reach. That's why US officials are calling for a stronger Pacific presence, closer cooperation with allies, and new technology partnerships aimed at countering China's northern advance. NATO, surprisingly, is also paying attention. The alliance's primary focus is still on Ukraine, but European leaders see the ripple effects. If Russian eastern territories drift under Chinese control, Moscow becomes even more dependent on Beijing, not just economically, but strategically. That weakens Russia's bargaining position everywhere else, including in Europe. For NATO, this means the old Cold War geography is shifting. The line of influence that once ran through Berlin and Warsaw may soon extend all the way to Vladivostok. So what happens next? Analysts tend to group the future into three scenarios. The first one, the most likely, is what they call the slow absorption path. Over the next 5 to 10 years, China will keep pouring money into infrastructure, leases, and special economic zones. Navigation rights along the Tumen River will become standard practice. Chinese workers and Russian citizens will continue to blend economically and culturally. Though Russia will still own the land, on record, China and North Korea will run everything. It is a soft takeover that doesn't trigger headlines but completely changes the reality on the ground. The second scenario is escalation. The war in Ukraine drags on and Moscow grows weaker. China might start formalizing its control through legal agreements. Long-term leases could suddenly shift outright to ownership. Chinese law enforcement or security contractors might appear to protect investments. That would make parts of the eastern frontier functionally Chinese territory, even without a border change. North Korea would deepen its role too, acting as a logistical arm of Beijing's plans while extracting steady fuel supplies and military aid from Russia. Then there's the third scenario, the worst-case one. If Russia's internal stability collapses, perhaps through economic crisis or political upheaval, the eastern frontier could slip away entirely. Local governors faced with chaos in Moscow might side with Chinese investors to keep their region stable. Large-scale migration would tilt the population balance even more. At that point, China wouldn't need to ask for control because it would already have it. North Korea, meanwhile, would secure its borderlands and expand trade under Beijing's protection. That would set off alarm bells worldwide. Japan, South Korea, and the US would feel forced to respond militarily or economically. The region could turn from a quiet frontier into a flashpoint almost overnight. It's not an exaggeration to say that Russia is playing with a ticking time bomb. Even under the calmer scenarios we've discussed, none of this seems pleasant or comes without problems. As foreign presence grows, governance becomes messy. Russian law enforcement will struggle with overlapping jurisdictions. Whose rules apply when a Chinese firm leases Russian land for 99 years and hires North Korean workers to build on it? If this trend continues, Moscow will find these deals almost impossible to reverse. You can reclaim territory lost in a war, but it's nearly impossible to reclaim territory lost through economics. Once people's livelihoods, education, and supply chains depend on another country, loyalty follows. China understands this better than anyone. It's playing a patient game, and patience is something Beijing has in abundance. Meanwhile, North Korea keeps collecting quiet victories. Every bridge it helps build, every worker it sends abroad, strengthens its position. Pyongyang gets the resources it needs, and even its people gain jobs they can't otherwise find at home. Its engineers gain experience working on modern infrastructure, and its leadership gains something priceless: relevance. In a world that largely ignores it, North Korea is suddenly useful again, not just to Beijing, but to Moscow too. Russia, in contrast, is running out of moves. The eastern frontier is slipping, not because of treachery, but because of exhaustion. This is the consequence of fighting an expensive war, losing access to Western capital, and over-relying on partners with very different agendas. Every decision that seems practical in the short term adds up to a strategic loss in the long term. China and North Korea didn't need to invade Russia's Far East. They simply waited for the right moment. What followed wasn't a takeover in the traditional sense, it was a quiet occupation of opportunity. The vacuum left behind had to be filled, and those who stepped in are now shaping the region's future. Officially, the map remains unchanged, but on the ground, the transformation is unmistakable. The eastern frontier still belongs to Russia in theory, but theory doesn't build infrastructure or pay local wages. For now, Moscow can still claim ownership. But control that exists only in law, without presence or influence, is the weakest kind of control. The world may not be watching closely, but the shift is already locked in. You can replace flags, but you can't easily reverse pipelines, trade routes, or demographic shifts once they've taken root. This story was never just about territory. It's about timing, leverage, and the power of quiet moves. China and North Korea saw the opening and moved in with precision. Russia, focused on survival, didn't notice until the cost of it was too late. An empire that once redrew borders with force is now watching its own fade without a single shot fired. And as history often reminds us, influence lost without resistance is the hardest kind to reclaim. Thanks for watching.